Motion for debate. The 75th anniversary of the arrival of the Windrush Generation. Lord Murray of Blidworth.
My Lords, it is a great privilege and honour to represent the government at this debate on a topic that matters so deeply to us all. We have, over the last few days and weeks, been making and marking a supremely special moment in our history. The people who arrived in Britain that June day 75 years ago, and in the months and years that followed, are an essential part of our national story. One can only imagine the sense of excitement, anticipation, and apprehension of those aboard HMT Empire Windrush as they felt as approaching Tilbury and as they disembarked. There would be hardships and obstacles to overcome, but through sacrifice, endurance, and an indomitable spirit, overcome they did. And in so doing, they played an invaluable role in rebuilding our country and our public services in the aftermath of the Second World War. They were, as His Majesty the King put it so aptly, pioneers. What has become known as Windrush Day was a hugely significant milestone for those beginning their new lives here. But there is meaning to be found not just for them, but for all of them, for all of us in that day. This was a seminal moment in our collective history, a symbol of the diversity that is a defining feature of our society. The Windrush generation, their children and grandchildren, have enhanced and enriched our society in myriad ways. We see it everywhere, in sport, culture, art, business, politics, the National Health Service, emergency services, the list goes on. So vast and so sweeping has been their contribution that it would be a fool's errand for me to attempt to do it justice in the relatively modest amount of time available to me. Instead, I will simply say this: we owe the members of the Windrush generation a huge debt. Our country would be greatly diminished if they had not come here 3/4 of a century ago. It is right that we cherish them. It is right that we recognise them, not only for all they have contributed and done, but also for what Windrush signifies. There are all sorts of ways we can do that, of course. This year's commemorations have been especially significant as we mark the 75th anniversary. It has been very special indeed to see the Windrush story showcased so prominently through events, documentaries, articles, exhibitions, and much more. Above all, it is through hearing and reading the accounts of those who were part of this unique story that one gets a true sense of their accomplishments. The anniversary has been joyous and poignant in equal measure, and I sincerely hope those being celebrated feel their voices have been heard and their contributions recognised. The government has supported that effort through educational, arts and sporting projects and activities across the United Kingdom. Of course, remembrance and recognition need not to be confined to anniversaries. We now have a magnificent national Windrush monument following its unveiling at Waterloo Station last year. The government was delighted to provide funding for the project, which stands as a permanent tribute to the Windrush generation and their descendants, and a powerful reminder of their contribution for the millions of people who pass through one of our busiest stations every year. Many, many people have helped to make the memorial a reality. I am grateful to every one of them, but it would be remiss of me not to single out the contribution of the noble Baroness, Lady Benjamin. Yeah. This is, of course, a subject of deep personal resonance for her, and I'm sure the whole House will join me in commending her not only for her work on the memorial, but on Windrush generally. Yeah. My Lords, the story of the Windrush generation is uplifting and inspirational. a story of struggles overcome, of resilience through adversity. That the story should come to include a chapter of suffering and distress in recent years is a source of profound sadness for us all. The terrible injustices that have come to light shocked the whole country to its core. What happened to the victims of the Windrush scandal was an outrage. It should never have happened. The effects remain painful and difficult. My department, the Home Office, and indeed the whole government, is absolutely determined to right the wrongs. And although compensation cannot undo the hurt that was caused, it was right that the government put in place schemes to provide documentation and to provide compensation. And I repeat the promises made by successive Home Secretaries that those schemes will not close. We have paid or offered more than £75 million in compensation. We have provided documents to thousands to enable them to document their status. While righting the wrongs will remain a key focus for the government, I know that some representatives of that generation are keen for the name Windrush to be reclaimed from the taint of that scandal. They want to see it returned to its original status as a symbol of all that is great about that generation and their descendants. A symbol as strong and as visible as the wonderful monument I spoke of a moment ago. This debate is an opportunity to reflect on all that the Windrush generation, their relatives, and their communities have done for our country. It is an opportunity to celebrate the 75th anniversary of the arrival of that ship, a ship of hopes, dreams, and opportunities. We are here to celebrate and thank those who came to work in the NHS, then, as now, a social innovation like no other, and one that is, of course, enjoying its own 75th Jubilee. We are here to celebrate and thank those who came to revive the post-war transport and industrial infrastructure, without which this country would not have flourished in the second half of that century. We are here to celebrate and thank those who brought new vibrancy and artistic energy to enrich our cultural landscape, and whose contributions have helped make Great Britain a world leader in the arts. And we know that members and descendants of that Windrush generation continue to serve their country in many guises, including in the police and fire services, education, the care sector, and social work. And we see other contributions made to our economy, our social fabric, and our futures, whether as businesses and technology leaders, artists, musicians, scientists, designers and researchers, and in sport and charity work. Our spiritual lives have been enhanced by the churches, faith groups, and religious leadership provided by members of that community and their relatives. By choosing to serve others, every generation inspires and encourages the next, and strengthens the bonds between us all. I look forward to a debate befitting the significance of this anniversary as we celebrate the undeniable achievements of the Windrush generation and subsequent generations. I know we will hear heartfelt and insightful contributions across the House. That being the case, rest assured I will very shortly take my seat. But before I do, I want to quote from an immensely powerful poem by Professor Laura Serrant. "You called, and we came," she wrote. My lords, that is exactly right. We called, they came, and I will ever be grateful that they did. I beg to move.
The question is that this motion be agreed to.
My Lords, I'm very grateful to the Noble Lord the Minister for bringing forward this debate, and if I may say so, for the tone in which he opened it. It is right that this House should take note of this important anniversary of the arrival of the Windrush generation. This is, as the Noble Lord the Minister has said, a moment to celebrate an enormous contribution of so many who came to rebuild Britain after the Second World War. Notwithstanding complex colonial history and a mixed welcome, they came as some of the most loyal and patriotic British subjects to work in our NHS, in construction, transport, and as the Noble Lord has said, other vital public services. Often, it has to be remembered, in undervalued and back-breaking employment. But we must also reflect, as the Noble Lord the Minister has done, on the betrayal of their children in one of the worst scandals in British history, in which inhumanity and illegality on the part of government cost people jobs, homes, healthcare, liberty, and saw some of them forcibly transported to faraway islands that some had never known in their adult lives, despite lives of hard work and service to the United Kingdom. Many died broken-hearted and still uncompensated. Some are uncompensated still. And I'm grateful to the Noble Lord for his update, but I hope the Noble Lady, the Minister, will take the opportunity to perhaps go further on ongoing plans to right that wrong and to do so for all outstanding claims very, very quickly. What is His Majesty's Government's estimate of outstanding claims for compensation? What prospect is there of resolving all such claims this year or before the next anniversary? My Lords, preparing for this debate gave me the opportunity to return to Amelia Gentleman's fine book, which will shortly be returned to your Lordship's library. The Windrush betrayal records not just outstanding and persistent independent journalism, but the real human stories of Paulette Wilson, who had worked in catering in the other place, Anthony Bryan, Sarah O'Connor, and countless others, and their lives devastated by a toxic cocktail, my lords, of culture war, cruelty, and incompetence, which we must never repeat. I commend the book to all noble lords, particularly those with a close interest in the workings of the Home Department. I remind your lordships that the background to that scandal, the scandal of demanding papers of people who had come to this country as children 50 plus years earlier, was called the hostile environment, a policy of targets which will always penalise the lowest hanging fruit, a policy, my lords, of deterrence. People who had evidence of working and paying tax for decades were detained and even removed, whilst their landing cards were destroyed in the annals of the Home Office. It is incumbent on those who speak from this particular spot always to mention ships. Today that task is easy. However, nonetheless, my noble friend the Admiral reminds me that the Empire Windrush brought not only Caribbean Britons, but a number of Polish refugees to these shores. And they were rightly, at the time, rightly welcomed by the then government, whilst the Refugee Convention was still being settled and negotiated. Today, my lords, the refrain is a little different. The refrain is stop the boats, a universal aspiration that should be striven for with justice and compassion, so that human beings are never again relegated to statistics with all the consequences that will necessarily follow. So debate the boats by all means, my lords, but never, never let us forget the stories of those who came in ships.
Yeah.
My Lords, I want to thank the government for having this important celebration debate and for their commitment to Windrush 75, which they have shown across many departments. And I want to thank the Noble Lord the Minister for his kind remarks. My Lords, 5 years ago, when we celebrated the 70th anniversary of Windrush, not many people knew what Windrush meant. Fast forward to the 75th anniversary, and things have completely different, which shows progress is being made. Every news channel, media outlet, and numerous magazines covered the anniversary. They couldn't get enough of Windrush. The scandal brought it to their attention. And this was partly due to the creation of the National Windrush Day, the 22nd of June, which was a result of the hard-fought 30-year campaign led by the late Sam King, MBE, a Windrush pioneer, and also the National Windrush Monument, created to recognise and acknowledge the contribution made by Caribbean people to Britain, which the Minister highlighted. My Lords, I was honoured and privileged to chair the Windrush Commemoration Committee responsible for overseeing that historic creation. This enormous task was a labour of love. It took 4 hard, challenging years, littered with many obstacles and setbacks. But with total commitment and dogged determination, a 12-foot-high, magnificent monument, which was designed by the world-renowned Jamaican artist Basil Watson, was delivered and unveiled at Waterloo Station last year on Windrush Day by the last 2 known living Windrush pioneers from 1949, Alfred Gardner and John Richards, and their descendants. My Lords, the monument has quickly become a landmark, and Network Rail led a 75th anniversary commemoration event there to celebrate their links with the Windrush Generation and lay the wreaths in their honour. My Lords, the Empire Windrush was not the first ship to bring Caribbeans to the motherland in 1948, but it's become a symbol of that quest. And the thousands who followed up until 1973 also showed great loyalty, courage, bravery, resilience, dignity, pride, and fortitude, despite facing rejection, humiliation, violence, death, hatred. They came with hope and optimism in their hearts. Many Caribbean people who visit the monument at Waterloo are moved to tears and overcome with emotion as it invokes memories of the treatment they received when they arrived in Britain. It's become a place of solace. Some say they wish their deceased relatives were still alive to see this momentous symbol. Many say, "Meet me by the monument." My Lords, I am part of that lived Windrush experience because I came to England in 1960 as a 10-year-old, travelling from Trinidad by ship, then by train, from Southampton to Waterloo Station, arriving at platform 19 with my grip. That's what we Caribbeans call our suitcase, proud. I stood just a few feet away from where the National Windrush Monument now stands. Who would have thought? That's why I say to children and young people, never give up. Always keep hope in your heart. My Lords, today in every part of British society, people are finally recognising the massive contribution the Windrush Generation and their descendants have made. We're no longer told, you've got a chip on your shoulder. This chapter of our history is now being acknowledged, celebrated, and studied in every corner of the country. My book, Coming to England, which I wrote 27 years ago, is now read in almost every school in Britain, and it's more relevant than ever today. I get letters from 7-year-olds saying they now know about Windrush, and they will never be racist towards anyone because of the colour of their skin or because they're different. My Lord's, childhood lasts a lifetime. So this gives me a great feeling of hope and optimism, especially when I think of the time when I came to Britain and my classmates relentlessly called me racist names, spat at me. They didn't know where Trinidad was. They told me to go back to where I came from. At that time, some Caribbean children were even put in schools for the educationally subnormal because of their Caribbean accents. However, my lords, things have not entirely changed. Unbelievably, I'm receiving letters from children who are suffering from racist abuse in schools and on the streets today, the way I had to endure back in the 60s. Some more education is needed. We have to fight this scourge. My lords, we are now at a significant moment in history. So I would like to ask the Minister, what is the government doing to further encourage the Windrush experience to be taught in schools as an important part of British history? We have got to see ourselves to know we belong. My lords, the National Archives hold copies of passenger lists of the many ships that brought Caribbean people to the UK. I wept when I saw my name on one. And it's worth mentioning, as the Noble Baroness had just said, that not only Caribbean people arrived on the Empire Windrush in 1948, but a number of Polish people too. And despite also facing adversity, they too have made an enormous contribution to Britain and should be remembered. This year, as part of the Windrush 75th celebration, the National Archives formulated an education schools project to empower ethically informed learning of British history. They arranged for me to speak on a web call to over 15,000 school children about my Windrush journey, which was so poignant. Yes, who would have thought? My lord, King Charles asked me to set up the Windrush Portrait Committee as he wanted to celebrate Windrush 75 by commissioning 10 portraits painted of Windrush elders over the age of 90. Windrush nobility, who have made a contribution to British society in areas like the NHS and to the economic well-being of Britain across the decades. They are pioneers whose shoulders we now stand on, as they had to overcome adversity and prejudices on a daily basis in order to survive. They have paved the way, and now they have a chance to share the trauma they carried and to tell their untold stories through portraiture. The portraits were unveiled at Buckingham Palace and will be shown at the National Portrait Gallery for 7 months and become part of the Royal Collection, representing communities nationwide. The BBC produced a moving documentary about the project, connecting sitters and artists as they captured the importance of this important part of British history. What a legacy. My lords, the Royal Mail have issued an incredible set of Windrush stamps, which I launched at the Black Cultural Archives, showing how Caribbean culture has helped shape Britain. And the beautifully designed 50-pence coin by Velda Jackson also celebrates Windrush 75 and honour those who have paved and helped the way for enriched British history. The King also held a Windrush 75th anniversary service at St George's Chapel, Windsor, for school children, which was truly inspirational. The church service at Southwark Cathedral brought church leaders and Windrush communities together from across the country. How things have changed. Because, my lords, when Caribbean people first came to Britain, we were told we were not welcome in churches and had to form our own black-led churches, such as the New Testament Church of God in 1953, which now has 130 branches across the country, full of worshippers. My lords, this year has seen jubilant celebrations of the Windrush 75th anniversary, as I believe we must not be defined by the so-called scandal. In fact, I propose it should not be called the Windrush scandal anymore, but renamed the Home Office scandal. Yeah. As they have caused the misery, trauma and heartache which still continues and still remains a stain on British society with the unresolved compensation issue of Windrush victims. My lords, I've heard from numerous lawyers of the compensation forms are so complex, even legally qualified people have difficulty filling them out. They tell me numerous claims have been rejected based on inconsistent reasoning and not fully considered even after appeals. There's a huge backlog of compensation cases. Only 25% of applicants to the scheme have received payments, and 93% of survivors have not been compensated at all. My lords, many are scared to approach the Home Office, as is also the public body of immigration enforcement, the threat of which many have encountered without the documentation to prove their lawful status. My lords, trust has disappeared and drastic measures are needed to bring it back. My lords, 4 years ago I pleaded with the government to establish an independent body to oversee the Windrush compensation scheme. My pleas and those of thousands of others have been ignored, so once again I implore the government to consider this proposal, or perhaps consider an amnesty and pay full claimants without the need for the traumatic, stressful and painful application process the victims are having to go through. After all, the money is there. My lords, we need to put the stain on British history of the Home Office scandal and hurt cause to the Windrush victims behind us once and for all. Yeah. The Windrush generation and the decent, compassionate people of this country deserve no less. Anything less is an insult to people like myself and the thousands of others who have dedicated their lives to this country and have made a difference to other people's lives. My lords, the Prime Minister needs to show he cares too by engaging with the Windrush community and the Windrush victims, which so far he has not. And public perception matters. My lords, I'm an optimist though, and I believe eventually good will prevail. But we all need to work together and continue to build a solid foundation for future generations. That's why I'm involved in establishing a National Windrush Museum, which will do just that, as it will bring together all aspects of lived Windrush experience. My lords, I was honoured to represent the Windrush generation and carry the sceptre of Dove, representing equality, spirituality and mercy at King Charles's diverse and inclusive coronation, which I believe is a glimpse into the future. So here's to more glorious, all-embracing British historic Windrush celebrations in years to come.
My lords, it is an honour but also a challenge to follow such an inspirational speech by the noble lady, Lady Benjamin. It is wonderful that a ship which it is believed was named after a river in the Cotswolds is now synonymous with a generation of mainly Caribbean people coming to the UK to make it their home. And what a celebration it has been over the last few years. £750,000 for community celebrations, the wonderful monument that many have spoken of in Waterloo Station, and the 10 beautiful portraits commissioned by His Majesty the King. Even walking home last night, one of those portraits of Alfred Garner was on the digital advertising hoarding as I passed by a bus stop. I suppose, my lords, though, I might be biased, as although brought up in rural, then monoracial Rutland, I have lived in Trinidad and Tobago. A food, a culture, a liming with friends, and a freedom in expressing your worship of God that I still so deeply appreciate. However, my lords, the presence of my noble friend from the Home Office alongside the noble Baroness Lady Scott from Communities and Levelling Up reminds us that this celebration has been tinged with sadness. Like many churches in the 1950s and 60s, the Home Office has not always treated the Windrush generation justly or kindly. There was, of course, a black community already in the UK. In fact, the first black-led church, Sumner Road Chapel, was established in Peckham in 1906. Such were the numbers living here. But Windrush was, of course, mass migration, which would change the UK, and I believe for the better. But, noble lords, I was also reminded recently by a British Jamaican friend that the reason his parents moved here was that they believed that there were no opportunities for the family, especially for the children back in Jamaica. The way the British were ruling Jamaica at that time, as it was 14 years after Windrush that Jamaica won its independence, did not give some confidence in the future for their children. And of course, so many did make a great future for their children and grandchildren. And although early Windrush migrants faced harsher discrimination than today, sadly some still exist. The data from the Commission on Racial and Ethnic Minority Disparity report from 2021 outlined that there are still issues and persistent issues, particularly in terms of education. I'm quoting now, in terms of overall progression, Black Caribbean pupils are the least likely of the main ethnic groups to progress to the more elite, high-tariff universities by the age of 19. This progression rate of 5.2% is less than half of the overall national figure of 10.9% for all pupils. Of the main ethnic groups, the Black Caribbean group is the least likely to attend university at all after the white British group. New evidence indicates that the attainment, obviously, in education is closely related to socioeconomic status, a topic in the headlines at the moment. But once that factor is controlled for, all major ethnic groups perform better than white British pupils, except for Black Caribbean pupils. So I'd be grateful if my noble friend the Minister could obtain an answer or could answer the question I have previously raised in your Lordship's House as to whether a specific Windrush scholarships for higher tariff universities and also Windrush apprenticeships could be founded. Although there are many other issues that need to be addressed to deal with such educational disparities, this would be an important marker. Of course, there is a tenacity within communities, as despite these educational disparities, and perhaps due to the length of the presence here in the UK, being the first mass migration of the 20th century, and I'm quoting again from the report, young people from the Black Caribbean group have a much lower unemployment rate than those from Black African ethnic groups, even though the prejudice faced by both groups is likely to be of equal measure. And although also, along with other noble lords, I think it's good to believe that the scheme is not going to close, but I do also query what positive action is being taken by the Home Office to find the claimants, not only to improve the processes. I do pay tribute to the work in the face of much scrutiny that civil servants have done, and perhaps I boldly say that the only uncontroversial fact of the scheme has been its co-chair, Bishop Derek Webley of the New Testament Church of God that the noble Lady Benjamin mentioned, who has worked honourably on such a controversial project. So I do hope that all the claimants will be found, and so the scheme can fade from our memory, as it is rather a cloud on an otherwise wonderful 75-year anniversary. So, my lords, whilst we celebrate deeply the amazing people of the Windrush generation, for some, though, there is a haunting of dislocation. Dislocation from West Africa, dislocation from the Caribbean, and a dislocation whilst living in the UK. We are only now beginning to understand the generational impacts for human communities of the severing of ties to land, communities, culture, and language. The generational effects of trauma for Indigenous people, for survivors of the Holocaust, might actually, according to research, even be carried in the DNA. We are all the richer and blessed for the UK Windrush generation, but let's never forget the cost and the suffering over many centuries.
My Lords, in the time available, I intend to confine my comments largely to the Windrush compensation arrangements, which have been the subject of debate in this House on a number of occasions. The independent Williams review into the Windrush scandal stated that it was, quote, foreseeable and avoidable, close quote. The compensation scheme is intended to compensate claimants for the losses and adverse impacts suffered. The original impact assessment said that there was, quote, significant uncertainty surrounding the volume of claims and associated costs, close quote, and that, quote, compensation and operational costs are estimated in line with the 11,500 eligible claimants' planning assumptions, close quote. And total compensation costs range from 20.5 million to 301.3 million, based on the volume range of 3,000 to 15,000 eligible claims, with a best estimate of 160.9 million, close quote. Those figures and the wide disparity they indicate reveal that the government hadn't a clue about the size of the issue they faced at that time, and indeed since then the projected estimated number of claimants has fallen dramatically and somewhat faster than the rate of inflation. Could the government say what their latest estimate is of the total number of likely eligible claims and how they have come to the conclusion that this is the likely figure? But what the government were pretty sure about was that the average compensation payment should be, since the original planning assumption of 11,500 eligible claimants, was going to give rise to estimated compensation costs of £160.9 million, or an average payment of some £14,000, a worryingly low and miserly figure, as has been argued in previous Windrush debates. Let's remind ourselves that these compensation payments are intended to cover losses ranging from detention and removal, loss of employment, loss of housing, loss of access to healthcare, lost education, loss of access to banking, and what is described as impact on normal daily life, which apparently includes, for example, missed key family events or inability to travel. And included in that must also be the feelings of rejection, humiliation and injustice, of suddenly being told wrongly that you have no status and no right to remain in or return to the country you've lived in for much, if not all, of your life, the country you proudly regarded as your home, in the same way as members of your Lordship's house do. Is all that worth compensation of initially on average £14,000, but which under pressure the government now appear to have been shamed into raising to £37,500 on average on the basis of the most recent figures following changes to the compensation scheme in December 2020 and August 2022. But let's get this into perspective. A recent former Prime Minister, and there have now been quite a few recent former Prime Ministers, once infamously described payment of £250,000 per annum for his newspaper column as, quote, peanuts, close quote. £37,500 is around a seventh of, quote, peanuts, close quote. When it comes to the level of compensation, we're not talking about some relatively minor event where someone got hurt. I'm aware, for example, of a personal injury case involving no loss of income and no hospitalisation as an inpatient, but instead loss of 3 teeth and bruising, which resulted in damages and compensation of some £22,500. Compared to that, on the Windrush Generation, Wendy Williams said, and I quote, "The many stories of injustice and hardship are heartbreaking, with jobs lost, lives uprooted and untold damage done to so many individuals and their families," close quote, and quote, "they had no reason to doubt their status that they belonged in the UK," close quote. Can the government, in their response, indicate what was the benchmark against which they determined that the fluctuating levels of compensation we're talking about, initially on average of 14,000, now an average of 37,500, are fair and reasonable and should not be higher in the light of the powerful words in the Williams reviews to which I have just referred? The compensation scheme was drawn up to save the government money, since the original impact assessment states under the heading Benefits of the Compensation Scheme that, quote, "the government will also mitigate the risk of litigation and associated legal costs, which is likely to be more expensive than compensation through the scheme," close quote. The low level of compensation payments also reflects the government's hostile environment policy and its austerity programme. In 2012, the then Home Secretary Theresa May said, and I quote, "The aim is to create here in Britain a really hostile environment for illegal migration," close quote. Clearly, the then Conservative-led coalition government didn't believe any previous government had pursued what they would deem a really hostile environment policy. Wendy Williams' Lessons Learned Review report said, and I quote, "The expansion of the hostile environment from 2014 would increase the reach of immigration controls beyond the Home Office including through increased demands for documentation to prove status, which would ultimately lead to the British people being caught up in enforcement of measures. Her review also stated that, and I quote again, the impact assessment for the bills leading to the 2014 and 2016 Immigration Acts didn't go far enough to identify or address possible risks of the proposed hostile environment policies. And indeed, the Permanent Secretary at the Home Office confirmed the inadequacy of the Department's impact assessments when he spoke to the Public Accounts Committee about the Windrush scandal on the 17th of December 2018 as follows, quote, "I completely agree that we should have spotted this issue. It should have appeared in our impact assessments. We should have understood the potential adverse effect of these policies on this population. I completely agree with that," close quote. Everywhere you look, you find that the Windrush generation were let down and badly treated by government and particularly the Home Office. If we were talking about more powerful and influential claimants who've been treated in the same way as the Windrush generation, would we be talking about an average compensation payment of just $37,500? I wish I could say yes, but I cannot. Indeed, would we still be talking, or would the matter have been dealt with and finalised a long time ago? Would the position have been the same if the overwhelming majority of claimants had been white? I hope the answer is yes. Wendy Williams told the Home Affairs Select Committee in October 2020, quote, "This is an opportunity for the Home Office to demonstrate that it's taking things seriously. If 164 people have been recompensed, I struggle to see how the department can justify that," close quote. Nearly 3 years on, the Home Office say that under 2/3 of far less than expected claims have had a final decision. Not exactly meteoric progress. I have some questions in relation to compensation payments. The government has said that the compensation scheme allows those who've suffered to avoid court proceedings in pursuit of justice. Could the government say in their response, if an individual accepting a final offer of compensation under the scheme does or does not then preclude themselves from pursuing the matter further through legal proceedings, if that is a step they wish to explore? Since there have been changes made in the compensation scheme since awards of compensation started to be made, can the government say whether those who received and accepted final offers before the December 2020 and August 2022 compensation scheme changes were brought into effect have had their compensation increased to fully reflect the impact those changes would have had on the compensation offers they received and accepted? How many people in this category had their compensation increased as a result, and how many, if any, did not? What percentage, if any, of Windrush compensation scheme settlements have been subject to confidentiality agreements in the last year, and why? And how many current Windrush compensation claims, if any, have been in process for over 18 months? There was provision for an independent review by an HMRC adjudicator where a claimant is not satisfied with the outcome of their case. Is that still the position? And if so, is it still the case the Home Office can then reject a recommendation of an independent reviewer? If so, how many cases have been referred to the independent adjudicator? In how many cases has the adjudicator increased the level of compensation? And in how many cases have the Home Office rejected a recommendation of the independent adjudicator? Rejecting recommendations is now an increasing feature of the government's approach. On the 26th of January 2023, the Home Secretary announced that the government would not be implementing 3 of the 30 recommendations of the Williams Review. Now, I seem to recollect the government having previously told this House that it was good news that all of the 30 recommendations have been accepted. If I'm right, can I take it that the government's position is that it is now bad news that only 27 of the 30 recommendations have been accepted? The 3 recommendations that are not now going to be implemented relate to running a programme of reconciliation events with members of the Windrush Generation, appointing a Migrants Commissioner, and reviewing the remit and role of the Independent Chief Inspector of Borders and Immigration. Wendy Williams' response was, and I quote, "I am disappointed that the department has decided not to implement what I see as the crucial external scrutiny measures, namely my recommendations related to the Migrants Commissioner and the ICIBI, as I believe they will raise the confidence of the Windrush community and also help the department succeed as it works to protect the wider public of whom the Windrush generation is such an important part." Close quote. One inevitably suspects that the present Home Secretary saw the Migrants Commissioner and an increased role for the Chief Inspector of Borders and Immigration as a potential source of challenge and criticism of government actions and policy. It's most unlikely that the decision was driven by what was best for the public, including the Windrush generation, rather than what was in the best interests of the Home Secretary and the government. Many fine words have already been said in this debate about the massive contribution of the Windrush generation to life in this country. Perhaps we should also express our appreciation by looking again at the level of compensation payments, which just do not seem to reflect the effects of what Wendy Williams described as the heartbreaking stories of injustice and hardship, with jobs lost, lives uprooted, and untold damage done to so many individuals and families. I'm asking the government to look again at the level of compensation payments, and I await a response in their concluding reply at the end of this debate.
My Lords, I'm grateful to His Majesty's Government for the opportunity to debate this very important anniversary. On the 22nd of June, I had the privilege of welcoming, together with the Archbishop of the Province of the West Indies, to the National Service at Southwark Cathedral, Their Royal Highnesses the Duke and Duchess of Gloucester, bishops from the Caribbean and from England, other church leaders, members of the community, and prominently members of the Windrush generation themselves and their descendants. It was a witness and thanksgiving to 75 years of change in Britain, the contribution those pioneers made, how we have changed as a nation, and the burdens we have made that generation bear. The previous week, my Lords, I attended a reception hosted by His Majesty the King at Buckingham Palace, at which the portraits he had commissioned, of which we have heard, of members of the Windrush generation were exhibited. We not only marvelled at the art, but met both sitters and artists. As many of your lordships will know, the King has previously commissioned series of portraits down the years for those engaged variously in the Battle of Britain, the D-Day landings, and those who survived the Holocaust. In each case, we witness in paint people who are the product of extraordinary lives and whose essential character is distilled onto canvas for future generations to remember, to interpret, and to cherish. This latest exercise in portraiture, my Lords, now on exhibition in the Royal Palace of Holyrood, while each of our different artists has a common feature of the miracle of human personality into old age, something I'm sure this House will appreciate. Many convey extraordinary power and joy. Others a quiet strength with struggles along the way chiselled into their features. What portraiture does, my Lords, is to remind us of the intensely personal nature of life, away from the great aggregates that normally determine policy. Here are lives that speak of what governments and communities did in the past and how we treat them now. It further reminds me, my Lords, of photographic exhibitions, the first at the Oxo Tower on the South Bank, marking the 70th anniversary of Windrush by the photographer Jim Grover, and a current exhibition, also by him, at Clapham Library in the Mary Seacole Centre on Clapham High Street until September. It includes an image of the War Memorial to African and Caribbean service people of 2 world wars that was installed in 2017 in Windrush Square in Brixton, in the heart of the global diocese of Southwark. Baroness Benjamin has spoken of the magnificent Windrush Monument unveiled last year at Waterloo. That, my lords, is really where we come in with Windrush. The Empire Windrush was a prize of war, a German liner renamed after a river in the Cotswolds, returning many ex-servicemen, for many of the Caribbean travellers on board had served in the RAF, to Britain, whose factories, mines and services faced shortages and whose infrastructure was worn out or in ruins. They were adventurous, but not needy. The fare was £28, 10 shillings, and it is rare now to find a group such as your lordship's house that knows what I mean when I say 10 shillings. A substantial amount for the average industrial earnings was then less than £6 a week. The Colonial Office billeted them in my diocese in a deep shelter at Clapham South, and the nearest labour exchange was in Cold Harbour Lane in Brixton. Hence the association with the area was established. They received a warm welcome from the nearby church of St John Angel Town. Would that all the churches our friends visited had extended them the same welcome. In many they were rejected. Sadly, that was not to be their experience of welcome, a cause of lament, shame and sorrow. The legacy of the last 75 years, my lords, is still with us. There are still disproportionate outcomes for which there is no ready or reasonable explanation. The instance of what we call the Windrush scandal. Amelia, gentleman of the Guardian newspaper, had been publishing articles setting out the problem with unsettling clarity for months. It is good that her book is in the chamber. The immediate proximity of the Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting in April 2018 made it impossible to ignore what she was saying. The Home Office and Prime Minister made a public acknowledgement of the wrongs that needed to be righted. Yet we need to note, my lords, that of those affected, only 1 in 4 who have applied to the compensation scheme has received any compensation. Lord Ross's speech is telling. 41 individuals who made an application have died while waiting for their claims to be processed. It is worth reminding ourselves, my lords, that the imposition of what was originally deemed to be a hostile environment by legislation in 2014 and 16, requiring proof of a right to remain, has deprived individuals of jobs, homes, benefits, and their health. In at least 83 cases, the final total is unknown, individuals with the right of abode or indefinite leave to remain were unlawfully deported by the government. It is, as one official has recently remarked, the crumbling of lives as the weight of unfairness and impossibility is forced upon them. To have to provide some of the very same documentation that was demanded to prove a right to remain in order to receive compensation does, my lords, lead me to deep concern. It is also a matter of regret, my lords, that the current Home Secretary decided to drop the government's commitment to follow through on the recommendations from the Williams inquiry to establish a migrants commissioner. That is surely needed. Reconciliation events also have been dropped, and to strengthen the powers of the independent Chief Inspector of Borders and Immigration. A commitment made is better when it is honoured. My lords, I am grateful once again to the government for facilitating this debate on a remarkable generation who had changed this country for the better. Those of us who live in the midst of great diversity need to articulate a narrative of appreciation and respect for the contribution of those who have helped us become the nation and people we are, equal in dignity, humanity and status in this united kingdom of different nations and peoples. We encourage the government to widen its declaration of appreciation to express a much deeper appreciation of the positive benefits of immigration, which has in so many ways blessed and enriched and changed our national life and identity.
Thank you, my Lord. It is a real honour to follow Bishop of Southwark. I thank the noble Lord Murray, for bringing this motion to this House. My Lords, it is indeed a real privilege and an honour to take part in this debate. This is a momentous occasion, the 75th anniversary of the Windrush Generation. It is a joyous moment that holds a great significance, not just for Britain, but also for the entire Commonwealth. As we reflect upon the past and look towards the future, let us embrace the remarkable contribution made by the Windrush Generation along with the other Commonwealth citizens. The Windrush signifies more than just a ship's journey. It also represents the courage and the sacrifices of all those men and women who left behind their places of birth and childhood friends, the places and the people they loved so much in search of a better life. They were the pioneers, the trailblazers who embarked on a courageous voyage to Britain after the war. Some of them had fought for Britain in the Second World War, and when the call came, they once more came to the rescue of the British industry. After the Second World War, Britain faced severe shortage of labour, and in order to build its infrastructure and economy, the government invited citizens of its former colony to fill the void in the labour market. Men like my father, who could not speak a word of English, but they had the guts to get off their backs and sail across the 7 seas in search of better economic life, to work in the foundries, mills, and the other heavy industries. Not only that, my lords, they brought with them a rich tapestry of music, art, cuisine, and literature, creating a multicultural mosaic that continues to thrive to this day. Their influence is evident in the diverse communities up and down the country. The vibrant neighbourhood that dots the British landscape. Look at the Notting Hill carnivals and the Punjabi Mela in the West Midlands. Colourful, cheerful, and vibrant. My lords, if we reflect back, the Britain of the 50s and the 60s was on the cusp of modern enlightenment. The new industry, the new thinking, new art, new architect, music, culture, avant-garde theatre, Beatles and the miniskirts. Like someone said, the wind of change was sweeping across Africa and Asia. But this is a big but, my lords. Equality, diversity, and inclusiveness was on its way to all the races, but still, it was some decades away. Racism, prejudice, and xenophobia was at its height. Non-white people were treated like a second-class citizen. They only did the jobs the others did not want to do. They were discriminated in all walks of life, in housing, jobs, pubs, clubs, in every other institution. They suffered just about every human indignity. But slowly and surely they overcame these indignities. Today, my lords, 75 years later, children and the grandchildren of all those men and women with fortitude are enjoying the fruits of their forefathers' labour. They are at the forefront of every sphere of our country's life, in music, art, literature, academic, sports, politics, and running our beloved National Health Service. As we reflect on this shared history, let us renew our commitment to building a society that values diversity, embraces inclusivity, and uphold the rights and the dignity of all. Let us honor the legacy of the Windrush generation and of the others, whatever the origin of their country, by fostering a future where every individual, regardless of their background or origin, can thrive and contribute to the collective progress of our society. Thank you.
My Lords, this is a marvellous moment where we can celebrate remarkable lives, great sacrificial people, or we can fill our faces with the tears and sadness of the distress they feel. 135 years before the Windrush ship came to the Tilbury docks, a great English writer, Jane Austen, gave us the words pride and prejudice. For so many who came on the Windrush boat and the Windrush generation, it was pride to come, to give, to serve, to sacrifice, to rebuild, to be representing their own dignity and their own freedom, proud to help Britain reshape, remake, and live again. But for so many others, it became prejudice, fearsome, troubled, traumatic, and turbulent, and ultimately incarcerated. I am a son of a Windrush family. My father came here in 1954. He was a dental surgeon trained in Edinburgh University, did a medical qualification, then a dental qualification, then a dental surgery qualification, a long journey. His father was before him a doctor, not serving in the Caribbean, but as a missionary in Angola, where my father was born. So having come to the UK to train, he then went to Jamaica. In the little town of Savannah-la-Mar, or Sav-la-Mar, or Sav, as the Jamaicans love to say, he met my very dear mother, now both long past. He fell in love with my mother while doing her teeth, which is a curious way to discover someone else's delight. And I always used to ask my mother, what did you have in there that was so fascinating? She never knew, but they married in the parish church in Sav-la-Mar and made their way in 1954, coming first of all up to Widnes, a strange little town in the northwest of England, where of course I was born in, well, dare I say it, in 1958. My father practiced at 103 Albert Road, Widnes. And I remember so very well in 1962, when I was just 4 years of age, walking with my mother up the high street towards my father's practice, an NHS dentist, because those were the days of NHS dentists. And as we walked up the road, and this was a gentle illustration of the travail that was around us, a lady stopped my mother, and as I recall the story, it always comes back to my mind. I see every second of it. There was I, a little boy, holding my mother's arm. It was a winter's day. She had a classic old-fashioned winter coat with a false fur, because we didn't have much money, around her neck. And this lady said to my mother, holding her arm, "Tell me, before you came here, did you used to live in trees?" Now, we laugh at that now, but back then, people's images of us were not quite savages, but certainly not sophisticated. That we'd come from poverty in order to enrich ourselves and as well as the nation. My mother's gentle and kind response, I remember it so well. She reached out her hand, took the lady's arm and said, "No, dear, we lived in houses just like you. And we walked on. She had that spirit of, I'm here to make a life for my family. I'm not here to fight your ignorance. Just a year ago, at an event in the City of London, a lady came up to me, noting that I was on the list of guests, and she said, "Was your father, Pertain Hastings of Albert Road, witness?" And I said, "Yes, it was." She said, "Well, your father did my mother's teeth, for which I'm eternally grateful to you." And I said, "Look at mine. They mirror my father's work as well." And we shared great grins with each other. Pride in service and support, joy in giving, delight in creating a new life. My brother, born in Huddersfield, having then moved to the United States to become the Dean of MIT, myself remaining here, becoming the Chairman, Chancellor of Regent's University, and now the Chairman of SOAS at the University of London. We've made life. But on the way here today, a Caribbean mother rang me to tell me about her son, 32 years of age, re-incarcerated for a minor, pathetic, minuscule error in approved premises, a man who served 10 years inside for crimes he should never have committed, however, released last year, now back in. Why? Because the prejudicial, discriminatory mindset of the system didn't want to give him the grace of a tiny mistake, given all the progress he'd made, but the assumption of continuing danger. That remaining prejudice is what causes this fear of policing and the criminal justice system. That remaining prejudice I experienced on Wednesday, after the teachers had taken their great parade past Westminster Square, had gone up as they were striking. It was difficult to get here into the parking facilities of the House. Using my pass, which of course entitles us to be present and not to be obstructed, a policeman barked at me in an unacceptable way that I shouldn't have moved until he gave me freedom to do so. I pointed out he had no right to obstruct. He didn't like it, but of course he couldn't stop me. If I was not me, I may well have been banged up against the wall. And that is the trauma that the Windrush next generation continue to live with and must be stopped. This is this week's Voice newspaper. Let's save our boys. This is talking about the fact that black pupils are 5 times, Caribbean boys, more likely to attend a pupil referral unit, and it's a virtual direct line to incarceration and imprisonment. The Department for Education knows it, the Home Office knows it, and here's the key figure: 1% of children, Caribbean children, get 5 good GCSEs at pupil referral units. In other words, persistent expected failure. So we want to restore the pride back into having been the people who came here to build, but the prejudice remains too persistent. As the summary on Wikipedia says of Jane Austen's great book, Pride and Prejudice, it's a story of girls, it says, who made hasty and rash decisions and learnt to pay the consequences. The people who came here as Windrush sacrifices didn't make hasty decisions, but those who hold prejudice against them frequently do, whether that's compensations, or it's incarcerations, or it's referrals to pupil referral units. So what I ask, my lords, and of the ministers here present, please stop skirting around these tough issues for young black men and women. Stop skirting around the incarceration pressures. Actually give us the pride back that was the reason for coming here and building a nation of equality and opportunity.
My Lords, it's been such a privilege to take part in this debate, to hear the testimony and the descriptions of earlier speakers. It's intimidating, obviously invidious to pick out particular speakers, but I obviously have to mention the introduction by the noble Lady Baroness Benjamin explaining how we got here, but I think we also have to pay regard to what was said by my noble friend Lord Rosser in his extraordinarily powerful explanation of why there is still so much discontent with the scheme, despite what the Home Office tried to do. Now, I hope that I will be forgiven for striking a personal note. Britain, London, and Brixton, in particular, owe a debt to the people of the Windrush generation for all they have contributed over the last 75 years. It is entirely right that we should testify to that debt in this debate. I mention Brixton because that's where I live and where my partner and I have raised a family, hence my territorial designation. Now, for the avoidance of doubt, I make it clear that I do not claim to speak on behalf of the people of Brixton. We have 3 excellent MPs who can do that so much better than I could. But I can speak for myself and testify to the debt that we owe to the Windrush generation. This is from my experience of living in that part of the inner city for nigh on 40 years, in an area that offers so much of what London, the greatest city on earth, has to offer. It is truly a melting pot, mixing the full range of cultures and experiences, even providing, at the extreme, a home for someone like myself who started life in North London. A truly multicultural society at ease with itself. Brixton makes no great demands on those who live here. You can certainly be yourself. Now, as the Right Reverend Prelate, the Bishop of Southwark, has already mentioned, these things happen partly by chance. The arrivals on that epoch-making trip on HMT Empire Windrush were housed in Clapham, and so it was to the Labour Exchange in Cold Harbour Lane in Brixton that many came to seek work on their arrival. Later arrivals followed their lead. They sought housing in the area, which at the time was cheap. Much of it was run down in multi-occupation and still suffered the scars of the late war. But it was available in those pre-gentrification days. They did not just come to Brixton, of course, but nevertheless, the result was and still is a special connection between Brixton and those of the Windrush generation. It has proved to be the centre of many of the events held to mark this special time. Now, there have, of course, been ups and downs, to say the least, over the 75 years, and some parts of the story are contested. Times were tough. The pioneers and the younger generations that follow had to cope with discrimination and poor living conditions. They had to battle for their civil and employment rights, and there is doubtless more that still needs to be done. But I believe, as an example, that in Brixton we have created something special that would not have been attained without those who came on the Empire Windrush itself and those who followed. Now, the noble Lord, the Minister, in moving the motion, in his tribute to the Windrush generation, I think got it right. The words were right, but of course it's not the words we're looking for, it's the actions. And I'm glad we've been rejoined by my noble friend, Lord Rosser, who put the point so clearly. What happened is shocking, which is only compounded by the difficulties that have arisen. Now, I do want to raise an additional issue, the frozen pensions policy, which has had a deleterious effect on the large numbers of those with a Windrush heritage. Not all, of course, but that simply goes to point up the injustice of frozen pensions. Now, I understand I don't have the right ministers here to get a detailed response, but it's important to understand that this is part of how people perceive how they're being treated by the government. The policy, for those new readers, is the arbitrary winners and losers approach to making increases in UK state pensions to those who choose to retire abroad. Recipients in some countries receive increases each year in line with those granted to pensioners in the UK, but those in other countries, totalling 500,000, do not. Their pensions are frozen at the date they moved abroad. So in real terms, their state pension falls each year. The impact is substantial. Simplifying somewhat, the basic state pension is currently £156 a week, but over half of those with a frozen pension are receiving £65 a week or less. That's lost income each year of £5,000 or more. Now, British pensioners in all but 2 Caribbean countries have these frozen state pensions. Those in Barbados and Jamaica are the lucky ones, but there are 300 with frozen pensions in Antigua and Barbuda, 1,300 in Trinidad and Tobago, 900 in Grenada, 800 in St. Lucia, and hundreds more spread across other Caribbean islands. The injustice of the policy is clear, but the government and past governments have hidden behind the need for so-called reciprocal agreements. We pay increases to our pensioners in country Y, only if country Y pays increases to its pensioners in the UK. But governments, succeeding governments, have consistently, for many years, refused to negotiate any more such agreements, leading to the entirely arbitrary distinctions we see today. Just to remind ourselves, members of the Windrush Generation were invited to live in and work in the UK to help run Britain, and they devoted their working lives to this country. It is manifestly wrong to punish them so severely simply because they have returned to their country of birth for their retirement.
My Lords, I'd like to declare an interest as London's Deputy Mayor for Fire and Resilience, as I refer both to the Mayor of London and the London Fire Brigade later in my speech. I would like to join others in thanking the Noble Lord the Minister for his warm words about the contribution of the Windrush Generation, and to say I've particularly enjoyed and feel privileged to speak in this debate today, not least hearing those Noble Lords speak whose journey to this house started with their parents deciding to take their families on a journey to this country on a boat from the Caribbean. It is really important to celebrate the pivotal role the Windrush Generation and their descendants have played in the UK as a whole, but particularly to London. And I would like to agree with my noble friend, Lord Davis of Brixton. It is indeed the most fantastic city in the world. My noble friend Lord Davis spoke with warmth about Brixton and the rich cultural and economic contribution that the Windrush Generation made to his part of London. In many ways, his London is also my London, and I spent my early childhood in South East London with Brixton and Brixton Market on our doorstep. And as an adult, when I returned to South London, I had the fortune to meet the late Sam King MBE, who's already been mentioned in this debate, but who, as my lords will know, was one of the first passengers to arrive on the Empire Windrush at Tilbury Docks on the 22nd of June 1948. Lambeth Town Hall is clearly based in Brixton, and the welcome the new arrivals received from the mayor there, and the Right Reverend Prevent noted that there was a welcome in one of the local churches as well. But at the town hall, it was one of the only formal welcomes that the newly arrived people from the Windrush received. The local MP also spoke up for them, and not surprisingly, many of the new arrivals made Brixton and the surrounding areas their home, and their descendants remain, as we noted, at the heart of the community. Sam King, as the noble lady Baroness Benjamin said, was one of the co-founders of the Windrush Foundation. He also became the first black mayor of Southwark. He was rightly proud of his journey and of what he achieved. And it is right that Windrush Square in Brixton, close to where he and other arrivals on the Windrush lived, is in the heart of that local community. In the narrative of post-war arrival, it is especially important to honour the acts and courage and service that preceded this, especially during the World Wars, which claimed the lives of thousands of their compatriots. While we celebrate the story of Sam King and the stories of the many others who came to help us build post-war Britain, the story of how they and their descendants were treated is clearly not one of which this country should be proud. We should and must celebrate those of the Windrush generation who worked in our hospitals, on our transport system, and who made an invaluable contribution to this country's success since that first arrival 75 years ago. However, we also, as other of my noble lords have already made clear, need to recognise the hardships and extreme prejudice so many of those arriving on the Windrush and later boats experienced. The Windrush generation was invited to this country, but yet they faced, and some of their descendants continue to face, terrible racist treatment in the UK. Despite these conditions, the Windrush generation helped to build our NHS, staff our Air Force and military, supported Londoners throughout London's transport system, and enriched the fabric of this country as a whole through lasting legacies in sport, music, founding the Notting Hill Carnival, and so much more. The prejudice is regrettably not confined to the history books in which it should belong. The Windrush scandal, this government's hostile environment, which has already been mentioned, has caused untold pain. The disgraceful treatment and then subsequent delay in paying the compensation that people are due is nothing short of shameful. Too many people are still waiting for apologies, compensation and access to justice. Others have already asked for clarification, and I look forward to the Noble Lady the Minister's response to the questions relating to this. A true tribute to the Windrush generation would be for the government to implement all of the recommendations in the Windrush Lessons Learnt review. It's highly regrettable that the current Home Secretary has watered down the Home Office commitment to accept all HMI Wendy Williams' findings in her review. I would like to ask the Noble Lady the Minister if the government will now review this decision and implement all the recommendations from this review. Funding for community organisations has been a key part of the Mayor of London's response to the scandal. In the years since the scandal first came into public consciousness in 2018, the Mayor has dedicated over £100,000 into funding for frontline organisations across London to specifically support Windrush communities. This includes dedicated funding initiatives led previously by the Joint Council for the Welfare of Immigrants and now led by Action for Race Equality. Previous funding was used for a range of activities, including campaigns, legal advice sessions, and outreach efforts to bring information and support to those who may not access it otherwise. In recognition of the way immigration advice access has been decimated by successive cuts, and in order to support Londoners to access their rights, the Mayor has consistently invested in efforts to bolster wider capacity of immigration advice and support services across our city. More recently, the Mayor has launched the Migrant Advice and Support Fund, which supports organisations providing specialist, holistic services to Londoners with immigration needs, including people from the Windrush communities. This fund provides £750,000 over 12 months. The Greater London Authority, led by the Mayor, stands with the Windrush generation in their fight for justice. The Mayor clearly is also himself the son of a bus driver, as he says often, who also came to this country to build a new life for himself and his family and contribute to this country's future. Much emphasis has been placed on the role of the Windrush generation in supporting Transport for London, the wider transport networks and the NHS. The Windrush generation had a much wider legacy on our city, including among black firefighters and other staff from London Fire Brigade, some of whom joined the Walk of Witness from Waterloo Station to Southwark. My Lords, this House has previously debated the culture review that took place at London Fire Brigade. No institution in this country is immune from needing to examine how it treats those from black and minority ethnic communities. As Deputy Mayor for Fire, however, I'm proud of how the Brigade is tackling this issue head-on and playing a leading role within the fire sector in addressing institutional racism and addressing the inequalities and prejudices it finds. No institution, no sector can be complacent, and we need to learn and adjust how we behave and how we challenge behaviours. I want to reflect finally, if I might, on a more positive note, a more celebratory note to this debate. I'd like this House to note the huge contribution of the Windrush generation and their descendants to the arts in this country, from the food of South London to music and literature and visual art. The Windrush generation brought a wealth of new musical styles with them, including jazz, blues, calypso, ska, gospel, Latin and reggae, and their descendants went on to pioneer many of the genres that are popular today, such as garage, jungle, grime, dubstep and drum and bass. In literature, we have many examples of remarkable writing, and some of this is now rightly taught in schools. I want to conclude by quoting the author of the novel Small Island by Andrea Levy, herself the daughter of Jamaican parents. There are some words that once spoken will split the world in two. There would be the life before you breathed them, and then the altered life after they'd been said. They take a long time to find, words like that. They make you hesitate. Choose with care. Hold on to them unspoken for as long as you can, just so your world will stay intact. For me, this quote is a reminder of how powerful, but also how dangerous words can be, how they can heal and how they can divide. In this debate, on this anniversary of the Windrush generation's first arrival in the UK, and in a week where we have, in this House, debated the illegal migration bill, I think we'd all do well to remember the power of language.
Speaking the gap, having given notice, and inspired to do so by the noble Baroness Benjamin, who made a passionate and at times justifiably angry speech, and who was herself very properly recognised and made a member of the illustrious Order of Merit. And there could be no better example of the Windrush generation and what we're talking about today. It was also appropriate, the noble Lady Baroness Tricross, who just spoke, talked quite considerably at the beginning of her speech about the National Health Service, and it really is a happy coincidence that we were celebrating the 75th anniversary of the Health Service on Wednesday of this week, and we have this debate today, because without the contribution of the Windrush generation and their families, the National Health Service would not have been what it is, and we owe them a very great debt. But, my lords, there's been an underlying theme to this debate, and it's one that I just want to dwell on very briefly. The underlying theme is really cruelty never pays, and do to others as you would be done by. And I think we have to remember that, not only as we think back with shame at what happened a few years ago, but as we look at the way we are tackling problems today. I was deeply disturbed to read in the newspaper this morning of the painting over the Mickey Mouse pictures and the other things that had been put into centres where unaccompanied children, and whoever is to blame for their being here, they are not. And it seemed to me a deeply unfortunate and frankly rather cruel gesture. And I think we have to remember that as we remember and repent for the way in which Windrush Generation descendants were treated a few years ago. Kindness may not get you everywhere, but it does get you a long way. And it does help to make a cohesive society. And if this debate is to have any legacy, it must be to make our society more cohesive, more united, and more, if I dare use the word, and I do so with pride, patriotic.
My Lords, I would like to open by thanking the Noble Lord the Minister for putting down this debate, and particularly for the tone with which he introduced it. I think the whole debate has been uplifting, but it's also been realistic. It's been realistic about the problems that are faced and the recent scandal. My Lords, the arrival of HMT Empire Windrush at Tilbury Docks on the 22nd of June in 1948 has become a defining moment of modern Britain. The ship carried about 500 passengers from across the Caribbean, and that generation and those that came after have shaped our society, whether by rebuilding post-war infrastructure, playing a key role in getting our transport network functioning properly, or by supporting the fledgling NHS. Yet the Windrush generation has not always been treated fairly, especially by governments keen to be seen as tough on immigration. But Windrush Day, and maybe this debate, should be taken as an opportunity to celebrate those who, by seeking a better life, have made all our lives better too. I first want to mention the Windrush scandal and then conclude on the more positive contribution the Windrush generation have made to our country. The Windrush scandal, or perhaps I should say the Home Office scandal, as recommended by Baroness Benjamin, began in 2018. It concerned people who were wrongly detained, denied legal rights, threatened with deportation, and in at least 83 cases wrongly deported from the UK by the Home Office. Many of those affected had been born British subjects and had arrived in the UK before 1973, particularly from Caribbean countries as members of the Windrush generation. As well as those who were deported, an unknown number were detained, lost their jobs or homes, had their passports confiscated, or were denied benefits or medical care to which they were entitled. A number of long-term UK residents were refused re-entry to the UK, a larger number were threatened with immediate deportation by the Home Office. This was linked by commentators to the hostile environment, a policy initiated by Theresa May during her time as Home Secretary. The Windrush Compensation Scheme was launched on the 3rd of April 2019, and there have been various reports criticising its effectiveness and slow rollout. It isn't known how many people were directly impacted by the scandal, but around 6,200 people have claimed compensation and 1,600 have received payments. Around 16,200 have been helped to secure documentation on their status or citizenship. 41 people who have submitted a claim for compensation have since died. Of the 2,235 claimed in progress as of April 2023, 16% had been in the system for over 12 months, and 7% have been in process for over 18 months. So I have some questions for the Minister. How many people are waiting for compensation from the government? How long does the government estimate it will take to complete all the active compensation claims? And does the government think that processing these claims should be taking this long? My noble friend Lord Rosses referred at length to HMI Wendy Williams' original review of the scandal, and I welcome him back to his seat, having had an absence of about 7 months. There are about 30 recommendations in Wendy Williams' report, and the government has not implemented all of those 30 recommendations, as we've heard. The government dropped recommendations 3, 9 and 10 to host a number of reconciliation events, introduce the Migrants Commissioner and review the remit and role of the Independent Chief Inspector of Borders and Immigration, to include consideration of giving the ICIBI more powers with regard to publishing reports. In January this year, it stood at about 8 of the 30 recommendations that the government had implemented. This is different to the figure which my noble friend Lord Rosser gave. I'll be grateful for guidance from the Minister about what is the correct figure. Also, the Guardian newspaper reported that the unit tasked with reforming Home Office post-Windrush was being disbanded. Is the noble lady, the minister, able to say whether this is correct, that the unit dealing with the Windrush claimants is being disbanded? And can the noble lady, the minister, also say whether there's any plans to enact recommendations 9 and 10 of Wendy Williams's report? But my lords, I want to talk more positively as well about the contribution descendants from this generation have made to our society. And I've done a quick review of the press and recent press articles, and I'll mention some names. Micah Paris, singer, broadcaster and actress. Colin Jackson, 100-metre hurdles Olympic civil medalist and broadcaster. Don Letts, film director. Jay Blaze, the repair shop host and charity founder. David Harewood, actor-director. Linford Christie, gold medalist. Linton Kwesi Johnson, poet, musician and activist. Clive Myrie, journalist and newsreader. Sir Steve McQueen, film director, producer and screenwriter. Don Warrington, actor. Sir Lenny Henry, comedian. The list goes on, and this was just from a cursory review of recent press. My lords, my right honourable friend David Lammy described these 75th anniversary celebrations as bittersweet, and the noble Lord, Lord Hastings, referred to pride and prejudice as a theme in his bill, in his speech. I think they're both right in the way they characterise these celebrations. And as an opposition spokesman, I say to the government that it is for the government to follow through on the promises it has made to the Windrush generation and to seek to rectify the wrongs of the past.
My Lords, I would like to start by thanking my noble friend Lord Murray of Blidworth for tabling what is a very important and a very special debate. It is right that the House takes this opportunity to honour a landmark anniversary in our nation's history. I'm sure I speak for us all when I say that the moving reflections we've heard today from across the chamber speak volumes about how much the Windrush generation means to us all and the mark they have made on our society since their arrival 75 years ago. I thank my noble lords for their contributions today, and I'm proud to be able to add to them in this response on behalf of the government. Last month, I had the privilege of attending the National Service of Thanksgiving at the Right Reverend Prelate's Cathedral in Southwark to mark National Windrush Day. It was a truly inspirational day of music, of prayers, and of shared reflections on the experiences and the impact of the Windrush generation and their descendants. My lords, these included a poem from a young poet laureate of Croydon, Shanique Benjamin, who called herself a hybrid of Jamaican, Grenadian, and Croydanian, which painted a remarkable, vivid picture of the rich cultural heritage of the Windrush generation and their wider influence. I can't do justice to her words, but I would thoroughly recommend watching an online rendition of that poem. It's a poem that brilliantly captures a flavour of the Windrush's generation's first impressions of their mother country in all its complexity. The sense of excitement, as we've heard today, the opportunity to help Britain rebuild, but also the struggles and the terrible prejudices they faced, and also the monumental part they and their descendants have since played in our nation's post-war transformation. We undoubtedly wouldn't be the multicultural success story we are today without all that they have contributed and continue to contribute in every sphere of our national life. The tributes paid by my noble lords pay a testament to this. For our part, the government is committed to celebrating this wonderful Windrush legacy through national and through local commemorations. My Lords, 5 years ago, we introduced Windrush Day in response to Patrick Vernon's hugely admirable campaigning, and I salute him again for securing this milestone around which we can all come together every year. Of course, one of the most permanent, and we've heard it today, and visible markers of our gratitude to Windrush Generation is Basil Watson's magnificent, and if you haven't been to see it, please go to Waterloo Station, magnificent national monument at Waterloo Station in London. It is incredibly poignant to think that long after the first arrivals are no longer with us, millions passing through Waterloo will continue to see this, and they will think of them and all they gave. I can extend the biggest of accolades to the noble lady opposite, Baroness Benjamin, who spoke as always so eloquently and so passionately in today's debate, as she always does, and for her work with my department and to get this monument built alongside the fantastic Windrush Commemoration Committee, and I thank them all. This year's commemorations are particularly special because they mark 75 years of the anniversary of the Windrush arrivals. And fittingly, my department is leading the biggest programme of Windrush commemorations since they began across the length and the breadth of the country. In the run-up to Windrush Day, the Levelling Up Secretary and the Home Secretary hosted a reception at number 10 to thank those working with Windrush communities, both locally and nationally. Rudy Page was awarded the Prime Minister's Point of Light honour in recognition of his outstanding volunteering efforts supporting Caribbean Commonwealth and ethnic minority communities. We've also announced our largest ever Windrush Day grant scheme, totalling $750,000 in funding, which is going to 45 community groups, local authorities and charities spread across the United Kingdom. And these span, and I'm glad Lord Davis of Brixham is here, because they span the Brixham Project, a community-led carnival of art, theatre and music, to the Black Story Partnership, which is putting on a myriad of events, from performances of West Indian music to a book launch at a commemorative Windrush 75 event in Birmingham. And thanks to the National Lottery Community Fund, sponsored by DCMS, we're backing a further 75 community events and activities. But as Baroness Benjamin and others have so passionately argued, we need to keep the Windrush Generation legacy alive by ensuring that young people learn from and celebrate this. And to this end, we're providing new educational resources on the National Windrush Monument website and have teamed up with the leading educational charity Speakers for Schools to organise a series of school talks by inspirational public figures with Windrush connections, such as Basil Watson and the actor Patterson Joseph. Available in person and online, these have potential to reach thousands of pupils across the country. My Lords, as we move through the debate, and starting with Baroness Chakrabarti, it was obvious that I needed to answer the questions and the challenges from noble lords on, first of all, the Windrush compensation scheme. I won't mention all noble lords, but you know who you were, and it will be in Hansard. But, my lords, the Home Office remains totally committed to righting the wrongs experienced by members of the Windrush generation. My noble lords, we recognise that no amount of money will ever make up for the suffering people experienced. So far, more than 75 million has been paid or offered under the compensation scheme, and thousands of people have been helped successfully to apply for the documentation confirming their status or British citizenships. Payments to date include some very significant sums. Lord Rosser brought up the fact that they were very small numbers, but over 240 people have been paid 50,000 to 100,000, and more than a dozen people have been paid more than 200,000. And the Home Office priority is to reward the maximum compensation at the earliest possible point to all these people. 66% of claims have had final decisions, and the majority of claims in progress are less than 6 months old, my lords. And in response to, again, to Lord Rosser, only 7% are more than 18 months old. However, there are 14 categories, and each person's experiences and their circumstances will be different. It is right that the Home Office takes the time to ensure that each claim is considered and is understood carefully so that they can offer people the maximum compensation to which they're entitled. That said, the Home Office will continue its efforts to reduce the time it takes to process claims, and the length of time individuals must wait for their claim to be allocated is substantive decision-making to a substantive decision maker is now less than 5 months, and that's down from 18 months a year ago. The Home Office is also committed to keeping open compensation and documentation schemes. So it is not closing. The scheme is not closing. It is remaining open, my lords. The Home Office firmly believes that moving the operation of the compensation scheme, as has been suggested, would significantly delay what we consider, and I know you consider, my lords, to be vital payments to the people. And all these have been reinforced, my lords, by an independent advisor to the scheme, Professor Martin Levermore, in his report, which was published in March of 2022. And since the scheme's inception, the Home Office has continued to listen to feedback from all sorts of stakeholders and has made significant changes and positive changes and improvements, and they will continue to do so as more evidence comes in. For example, in 21 and 22, the Home Office published a new claims form, as was mentioned by Baroness Benjamin, in collaboration with stakeholders. Now, I know it's a longer form, but stakeholders are in agreement that it is an easier form. It is in plain English, and it's have much more targeted and simpler questions for people to understand and to complete. And as I said, all these changes that we're making are being made in conjunction with stakeholders. The Home Office has a multi-layered approach to reviewing the process continually to ensure that we have an appropriate level of external scrutiny. And I know this was brought up by a number of noble lords, including Lord Rosser and the Right Reverend the Bishop of Southwark. The Tier 1 review is conducted by a separate team that has not worked on any claim, so they are totally independent. The Tier 2 review is an independent review process with the Adjudicator's Office, and the Home Office has accepted all recommendations made by that adjudicator. I mentioned Martin Levermore. He regularly engages with officials and he publishes annual reports on the scheme, and his second report was published in May 2023, and that's on .gov.uk. And also the Home Office publishes a fact sheet and it has granular transparency, and that's published every month, and that will provide details on a wide variety of aspects on both the casework but also the ongoing reviews, my lord. There was, as I've said, there is no cap or limit on the amount of compensation that the Home Office will pay out. And when the scheme was announced, it was assumed that a high proportion of those that applied to the status scheme might then seek compensation. And it is interesting that although over 16,200 individuals had been provided with documentation confirming their status or British citizenship as at the Q1 of 2023, experience has been that many of them have not suffered losses or detriment owing to being unable to demonstrate their lawful status in the UK, and so they have not needed to claim compensation. But I think it's really important, Baroness Berridge brought this up, that we do continue to outreach to those communities to ensure that everybody understands the scheme and understands how to contact the scheme. So the Home Office has hosted 200 engagement outreach events, including 120 of one-to-one surgeries since 2018. It's worked closely with grassroots and community organisation, reaching hundreds of thousands of individuals through the Community Fund. And it's also run national media campaigns, and it will continue to make those efforts to reach anybody that so far hasn't contacted us. So I think we are doing everything we can, and I hope that's answered a number of questions. But there was some very specifics. Lord Rosser asked about benchmarks and responses to the call to evidence public consultation public consultation shaped, my lord, the design of the scheme. We considered guidance in the Parliamentary and Health Service Ombudsman's principles for remedy on establishing time-limited compensation schemes and other schemes of good practice in that sector. The December 2020 changes increased compensation under the impact of the life categories to bring them more in line with the Judicial College guidelines for the assessment of general damage in personal injury cases. So, my lords, we've gone through the normal process that we would do to look at benchmarking for this compensation. Lord Rosser and Baroness Twycross and the Right Reverend Prelate, the Bishop of Southwark, brought up the issues of Wendy Williams' three recommendations, which Wendy Williams, when she wrote her report, she recognises the challenges, and she applauded the Home Office response to this challenge. And because of that, as I've stated previously, we have regular reviews, the Home Office has regular reviews, and it delivers the intent of all the recommendations, but not in that specific way. Extensive, continual consideration of how to deliver this scheme is embedded in the department and throughout the department. The independent examiner of complaints set up last year in response to the Windrush Lessons Learned review is in place. There is insight and there's challenge, my lords, also from the Windrush Working Group. And there has been major internal change of the culture and the willingness to listen as policies develop and implementation has begun and will continue. The Home Office will continue to challenge itself internally on its culture on this subject. Lord Rosser also brought up the issue of compensation previously accepted and if claims are re-looked at. And yes, whenever changes are made, they are applied, my lords, retrospectively. The Right Reverend Reverend Prelate, the Bishop of Southwark, brought up the important issue of deaths of claimants while still awaiting compensation. And I think it's really regrettable that any claimant passes away before a compensation award can be made. And the Home Office does prioritise claims where we are aware of any critical or life-shortening instances in any claimant. And where someone does pass away before their claim is finally resolved, we do work closely with the representations of their estate, which is normally obviously their family, to ensure compensation is paid as quickly as it possibly can be. Baroness Berridge brought up again what I think is a really interesting idea that she's brought up before in this chamber on a specific Windrush scheme for scholarships. And she knows I've passed this on to the Home Office. And I haven't had a response yet, but I have promised her and I will give her the response as soon as it comes through. She also, and so did Lord Hastings of Scarisbrick, bring up a really important issue of the outcomes, the educational outcomes of young black men and women. It is more complicated than just all black men and women. It depends on their heritage quite a lot. I know the DFE has done a lot of work on this. I know they've got a lot of information on this. I don't have it at hand, but I will certainly go to the DFE and ask them if they could write a letter, and I will put a copy in the library. I think I may not have answered all, particularly Lord Rosser's technical issues. We will look at Hansard tomorrow, and my noble friend has said he will write with anything further that I haven't covered. But my lords, in conclusion, I want to thank everybody here today for your really powerful contributions and your tributes to the extraordinary Windrush generation, and emphasise the government's unwavering commitment to ensure that we never forget what they have done for us in this United Kingdom. We are so thankful that those first 500 people made that journey and arrived on our shores on a day in June 75 years ago, a momentous day. They are a credit to their community and to this country, and it is the greatest of privileges to be able to celebrate and honour them today.
The question is that this motion be agreed to. As many as are of that opinion will say content. Content. Not content. The contents have it. Change. Motion for debate. Report of the Communications and Digital Committee